So, I've been wanting to talk about this for a long while now, but I decided to pull the trigger on outlining one of the most important pieces of background lore in my current novel, Records of Farn, specifically revolving around the 18 demon god lords, also known as the Abundant Argon. Each of them is the demon of one sin, and yes, there's 18 of them, because there's 18 sins, because 7 is wholly uncreative. You can do a lot more than just 7 sins. They are the 18 most powerful demons in existence, and by virtue of being gods, again, this is a setting that has a lot of gods from various different pantheons. Demons are one of the pantheons. Their existence is literally written, and I do mean literally written, into the very code of the universe. And I've hundreds of pages of notes on the Abundant Argon alone. Like hundreds upon hundreds of pages, and that's not even including the pages on demons. Both because I used the Abundant Argon to figure out how divine beings work on Farn, and because I found them to just be interesting characters. And demons are one of the most active, influential pantheons on the very landscape of how Farn has reached its modern day. And I don't want to spend too much time summarizing the mechanics of demons and demon gods and demon god lords and how each differ from the others, but I will briefly mention that each of the Abundant Argon could desperately use therapy. But by virtue of being prideful and stubborn and masking their weaknesses, none of them are likely to ever seek therapy from the immortal therapist, who I should also talk about at some point, because I can talk about the immortal therapist. There is an immortal therapist on Farn, and it's worth talking about, just not today. So instead, I want to give a rundown on each of the 18. Loosely speaking, the first demon is Belreach, the first damned, demon of the sin creation and the father of all demons. He wasn't created as a demon, but some unknown force tasked him with creating the concept of a demon and the limits on them. He achieved this, but in his own desires made himself the first of such beings, in essence. So he was the original king of the demon realm, ruling over all of demonkind as an initially uncontested ruler. And there is a deliberate lack of detail to him because this is a time period predating most deities even existing. So a lot of the details to him are deliberately left undefined. However, I will say he's not currently master of all demonkind, despite being their progenitor, and only commands a fraction of them. Excuse me. The next two demon gods, god lords, who technically became demons before Belreach, are the sibling spouse duo of Bemoheth and Athaneva. And yes, sibling spouse in the Zeus Hera sense of sibling spouse, invoking all of the pantheons on Earth who have a male and female sibling duo who are married. And it's in a lot of our religions, like Egyptian, Greece. I think there's also some in other cultures as well. Well, it's pretty common in mythology. And having them be paired together like that is, in my little way, a nod to that aspect of religions on Earth. And yes, it is one of the main reasons they became demons. Because, gods can do basically anything, demons can do whatever they please, so demon gods can do whatever they want for whatever reason. And, excuse me, acid reflux from my meal. And again, that's one of the things that I need to go to a doctor for, but at the same time, I can't afford a doctor, so like. But I digress. Back to the video. If you were to add an L and an I to Ataneva, I think the anagrams would be clear, but basically, they're essentially Behemoth and Leviathan, just with the order of the syllables redone slightly. And there's not much to them, but they were originally proto-spirits, and it's important to note that spirits are in kinda sorta their own pantheon. They're divine beings that are all together, but at the same time they don't really have the same structure as pantheons in that they do not have the same level of worship and deliberate influence. Like they can be summoned and they can influence things when summoned, but they don't really actively have a will of their own to inflict, by and large, at least as a whole. So, but I digress. I can talk about other pantheons, including spirits, another day. Wait, but yeah, like Behemoth and Ataneva, or proto-spirits, the form of beings that would eventually coalesce to become the great spirits. And those two were supposed to be the top two in the pantheon of great spirits. And like, the pantheon of great spirits does have replacement top two gods, but Behemoth and Ataneva were intended to be those top two great spirits. However, when Belreach began defining what demons would be, these divine beings, these proto-spirits, decided effectively, sure, why not? And just became demon godlords. Because they could. And individually, Ataneva, the first chaos, is the demon godlord of the sin chaos. Imagine that. As she is quite literally primordial chaos. She defied what she was meant to be and lives to cause as much as possible. Behemoth, the first beast, is the demon godlord of the sin existence, as his very existence as a demon is blasphemous to the very universe. Again, because he was meant to be the top god of the great spirits, but as a proto-spirit opted to not become the first great spirit and instead exist as one of the first demons. And together, the duo of Behemoth and Ataneva are considered the progenitors of all monsters because they are what birthed monsters across the land of Farn. And yes, a lot of excuse me, a lot of the lore behind various pantheons, you will see some pretty obvious influences on, and like birthing all monsters is, kind of echidna. Like they're basically together the echidna of Farn in having birthed all the monsters. And like there's not really much to their characters because they're pretty self-explanatory. Their essence is simple and their power as primordial gods unrivaled except by other primordial gods. The fourth demon god lord is where things get a lot more interesting because he's Ludin, the first fallen. And that's because like he was something else and he fell to become a demon. And he is the demon god lord of the sin Pride. He is the ruler of the Citadel, the central fortress in the middle of the demon realm. And by virtue of the abundant Argon meeting in his kingdom in the Citadel, he is the de facto leader of demon conferences. It's not always him leading the demon conferences, but by default, he is the de facto leader of demon conferences. And by extent, technically the leader of all demon kind. Like, the thing about the abundant Argon is that they don't really have a leader, and each of them has their own kingdom, so they're all equal to each other in power. But at the same time, if you were to have a technical leader of leaders, it would be Ludin. And, like, he earned it by exactly what he did. Like, he is considered the king of demons, and if you couldn't guess, he's the reason Belreach isn't king of demonkind. He was a bit of an upstart and gathered an army which waged a demon war, conquering land after land, and largely in the demon realm. And he built the citadel with his armies and then resisted Belreach's siege of it. Like, that citadel is like, it dwarfs Minas Tirith in terms of structure. And like, I do have the specs of it, but it would take me a while to describe it. I don't want to spend that much time describing it. It's basically larger than the largest city in terms of diameter, and like, it is huge. And Belreach actually got pretty close to breaching all of it. He breached a few layers of it, like the first layer, second layer, third layer. He just couldn't get through every layer of the citadel in order to actually get access to Ludin and win the war. So, like, it was a long stalemate, which by atrophy, Ludin came out ahead of. But the two, with Mastamo's help, eventually reached a truce, which would ultimately end up dividing the demon realm into, I'm pretty sure it's 16 parts, controlled by the 18 abundant Argon. And I think it's 16 because Athaneva and Bemoheth share a territory because, you know, they're together. And one of the abundant Argon has her realm as a small portal, which is half outside of the demon realm. It doesn't really count. Like, it is her kingdom, but at the same time, it's not really a true part of the demon realm. It's just touching on parts of the demon realm. But it's still, like, it both is and isn't part of the demon realm, and it's her realm, her kingdom, so she has that. The other 16 parts are there, although one of the parts is just a small ring around the citadel, essentially. And you might ask who Massimo is, and I will cover him later, because he's one of the younger demon god lords. So, this is a good time to ask, if he's one of the younger abundant Argon, how was he there for the first demon conference? And that's because all 18 were. I don't want to ramble too much about it, but basically, the demon god lords, by virtue of being written into the code of the universe, have always existed, and their presence can be felt throughout all of time by virtue of having always existed, despite them having tangible time frames they manifested on Farn. They've always been around. Those who can be summoned have always been summoned, and for thousands upon thousands of years, even if they were younger than the time they were summoned. So while only 4 demon god lords at the time of the first demon conference had manifested, all 18 were still present. But I digress. Back to Ludin. Ludin, if you couldn't tell, is loosely based on the concept of Lucifer as a fallen angel. And that's important because, like, the archangels have the opposite of Lucifer. If Lucifer were considered to be an archangel that never had a fall, kinda, sorta. But I'll talk about that when I inevitably ramble about archangels. So, well, for now, just need to know, Ludin is loosely based on the idea of Lucifer as a fallen angel who becomes ruler of hell as the father of sin, and so on and so forth. Christian lore, insert here, you get the idea. He has a rather Darwinian approach to demons, where it's survival of the strongest. If a demon isn't strong enough to figure out how to survive, they don't deserve to live. And like, that is an oversimplification. He does have a very nuanced definition of survival of the strongest. Like, strong isn't necessarily physical strength, is what I'll say. And his backstory is something he deems only his equals of knowing. So there's quite literally a what would it be called? A mirage, a spell, a charm, basically a hypnotic effect, super duper powerful, that prevents anyone who is not his equal in standing from knowing his backstory. Every time anyone would try to figure it out, if they figure it out or get too close to figuring it out, they'll forget what gave them that breakthrough. They'll forget all of the information involved, unless they're his equal. But what is known is that he was originally a member of a different pantheon, which by the nature of the pantheons around at the time could only have been either one of Elun's pantheon or him being among the pantheon of the archangels. And that's because, like, when he fell, there were only a small handful of pantheons around. It was like 6, 7-ish pantheons around. So that's why it could really realistically only have been a few options. The options where he would have undergone a fall would be Ellen's pantheon, or the being an angel of some kind. And that's also because he was originally genderless. This is known about him. And those are the pantheons that have genderlessness. The other pantheons are more gendered. And part of his sin of pride was him becoming exclusively male, abandoning any genderless, gender fluid, or feminine forms or parts of him, and fully embracing the identity of male. And, like, that is actually a very big thing, because, like, genderless deities can present as male or female, but there's always a level of fluidity and also having them be in touch with their other side. So, like, forcefully cutting off the feminine half is not a good thing, essentially, in this case. Like you could argue that, oh, he's a trans man, but really it's more like a toxic man that refuses to accept any idea of femininity behind it. And, like, you could argue either way, essentially. Like, it's meant to be something that is not explicitly good, not explicitly bad, but is also something that is relatively unhealthy and leans towards having been a big thing. Excuse me again. And, like, I do know the details of what his backstory are, and it is pretty interesting, but I don't want to share them at the moment because it would take another full video to cover it, essentially. I'll say that he's really, really complicated in a way that I think is really cool, but I don't want to reveal what the convoluted circumstances were at this time. I will share, though, that he was the first demon godlord whose presence had a tangible consequence of ripple effects on Farn throughout all of time, essentially. Like, what he did continues to affect Farn to this day. And that is something that Belreach, Bemoheth, Atheneva, they didn't have that kind of effect. And most of the other demon godlords don't have that effect, where they continue to influence Farn from what they did. But Ludin's, again, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Ludin's influence was just that big. Like, what he did ended up essentially having a never-ending loop of effects on Farn. Like, he caused one of the archangels to suffer a brief episode of diverging from the intended path of the archangels, which is a big, big, big thing. It's only happened 3 times, and I can explain that more when I go into the archangels in their pantheon. And that archangel, Lucy, suffering her brief episode of falling from grace, essentially set off a chain reaction across every pantheon, including influencing the other 2 archangels to suffer a temporary divergence from the intended path to have their divergences, which in turn creates the circumstances leading to the birth of over half of the abundant Argon in total. Like, Ludin essentially is the reason that half of these people ended up becoming demon god lords. It's like, never directly, but indirectly from the consequences of his actions. So, in short, what he did was so egregious, it shaped the majority of all misfortune on Farn. Like, he might not have invented demons or been the first, but he effectively is the indirect architect of every misfortune on Farn to follow, including the presence of the 5th abundant Argon, and that would be Lilith, the first succubus. She's the demon god lord of the sin lust. Now, Lilith is a main character in Records, so unlike the rest of the abundant Argon, where I need to make videos on their background and lore in order to actually have it be known, she actually gets a chance to tell her backstory. And I don't want to say it too much, but I will share that it's pretty bad. It's pretty dark. She went through some pretty bad things. I will say, though, that she was the first mortal ever to ascend to godhood. And one of her secondary titles is the Last Primordial, because she is the youngest of the primordial gods. Primordial gods essentially is gods of eldritch nature, of eldritch power, of eldritch age. These are gods that are over 200,000 years old, who have countless powers and lifetimes of experience influencing Farn, and are essentially the most terrifying of the old gods. And she's among them. She's the last of the old god, well, the youngest of the old gods, the gods predating the landscape of Farn as it is currently known. And the reason she is the last of them is because of her being the first mortal to become a god. She put an end to an era of various pantheons waging a divine cold war against each other. And the reason it was a divine cold war and not a divine war is lore tied to 2 other pantheons, and I can share that in a different video. But basically, pantheons can't rival pantheons can't directly fight each other without very, 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 very bad things happening to both. Like, anyone inside of the same pantheon can fight each other. Like, a demon can fight a demon, but a demon fighting an archangel would be a very, very, very bad thing, essentially. So they fight indirectly. They wage divine cold wars, or at least they did, because once Lilith ascended to godhood, they all had to pause and collectively go, oh shit. Our actions can have consequences, birthing gods equal to us in power. And none of them want that. It is like, it is in part because, like, those birthed by gods that would become equal to them probably went through some shit that makes them not so happy about those gods. So essentially, like they, the newer gods ascended, any mortal that would ascend to be a new god could unravel the plans of the gods already there by virtue of having become a god and being upset at what those other gods had done. So it it necessitated a level of caution. Now, obviously, all of the younger abundant Argon still formed, so obviously there are still some divine beings intervening with consequences, but they did it a lot more carefully because her ascension to demon god lordhood represented a cosmic shift in the effects of the divine on Farn, with their influence scaling back from daily and nearly omnipresent to more passive and only on occasion. So, like, before Lilith, the gods were basically reshaping Farn daily, heavily intervening at every possible occasion. After Lilith, they were a lot more selective and had deliberate choices be made on when they would be intervening. Because she showed mortals could become equal in power to all prior gods, that level of caution was needed because, like, Lilith instantly informed them essentially that she would hold grudges, others like her would too, and because the circumstances leading to such extreme suffering necessary to birth a god are things that the god would not be happy about having happened in the first place. Like, it takes extreme circumstances and extreme suffering and extreme despair and basically living a hard life that nobody should ever have to live in order for God to be birthed. So, like, Lilith went through that again, like, pretty bad stuff that I don't want to say today in this ramble. I want to show it in the novel. But it was bad, and when she became a god, that effectively ended the era of the primordial gods intervening on a daily basis. So it takes a while for more to show, and they don't really have a strict order. But the next demon god lords formed less than 200,000 years ago, but over 70,000 years ago. Sanatas the Destroyer is the demon god lord of the Sin Wrath. He's effectively Poseidon, Krampus, and Satan rolled into one. He was a proto-beastkin, a tribal leader who was very angry at the oppression his people were facing at the hands of mountain humans. Read Caucasian humans. White people. The result of this was him becoming one of the 4 abundant Argon associated with the apocalypse, as in his presence on Farn is a sign an apocalyptic event is likely to occur on a grand landscaping-altering scale. And Bemoheth and Nathaneva are 2 of the other 3. Tricera, the exiled Fae, is the demon god lord of the Sin Order. She became a tyrant ruling the Fae realm with an absolute order and with strictness, rules, and basically an iron fist of despotism. Now, Fae on Farn are pretty much exactly what you would expect them to be. Like, everything stereotypically Fae, essentially. Well, almost everything. Like, no Like, no universal inherent weakness to iron, no strict rules. They're inherently agents of pure chaos. Their only rule is that rules are more like suggestions. So, like, when some when creatures of that nature are subjugated, imagine the scope of how how bad it was for beings like that to be exposed to what Tricero did. She subjugated divine beings because the Fae are divine, like spirits, like demons, like angels. As the Fae are divine beings, just of chaos, and she put them under the very antithesis of their nature. She introduced gender to the previously genderless Fae, and her control over what shouldn't be controlled had devastating effects on the Fae. It ultimately led to the creation of the Fae Arbiter, a creature which is simultaneously Fae and yet not Fae, simultaneously has gender, yet not gender, simultaneously has power over all Fae, yet is entirely powerless, simultaneously exists only to resolve issues of cosmic scale, while also existing to provide the best for all Fae, and is both mortal yet immortal, the ultimate contradictory Fae, even among the Fae being inherently contradictory, who is everything and nothing simultaneously, and yes, think Schrodinger's cat, essentially. The next one is Milady, the dragon reject, and she is the demon god lord of the sin blind obedience. To understand her, I would have to explain the nature of the dragons, who are their own pantheon, but I don't want to go on a tangent on an entire different pantheon of gods. Loosely, though, I can say that dragons, similar to fae and spirits, are inherently divine beings, like demons, like angels. Those dragons are divine. So, Milady was born divine already, and she was the youngest of the first generation of dragons to inhabit Farn. Like, all of those dragons are still around on Farn and are basically flying cataclysms where they can wreck things. Think Veldor Tempest level of destruction. And, yeah, that was actually a big inspiration on dragons. Like, everything dragons stereotypically do in fantasy settings, like smog, etc., etc., etc. Like, dragons inherently seek having a horde. They are inherently greedy and selfish and arrogant, seeking power and to assert their dominance over lesser creatures, usually by ravaging lands, like pillaging them, burning them, laying waste to entire civilizations. That's what dragons do. And Milady rejected her dragon nature and fought for the people. She fought her siblings and won against them because, despite being the youngest, she was also one of the strongest. However, this rejection of her nature progressively took a toll on her and left her vulnerable and weak. And she didn't want to be, so she sought a solution, and someone promised her an answer if she followed his will without question. And she did. But he both literally and figuratively backstabbed her and was just using her. The turmoil of her inner conflict, the betrayal, the loss, and the toll of the horrific tribulation she suffered because of her betrayal led her to go on a Lilith-scale rampage because Lilith basically earned the oh crap reaction from what she did overnight. And Milady did something equally large in scale, and that caused her to ascend to demonhood despite already being divine. Similar to how Tricero did a travesty that caused her to become a demon despite already being a type of divine, in her case Fae. Milady went from one type of divine to being technically two types of divine, both a dragon and a demon. And from the ashes of what she burned down, she used the lessons of her tormentors to build her own empire. So like she used their teachings to essentially do what they did, but a whole lot better. And she went from always smiling, having a wide grin, boisterous in nature, her very like forward bruisery, like hyper punchy and fighting and show offy, like loves to brawl essentially. She went from that to permanently just wearing a stoic look because she was just that broken. And despite everything she went through, part of her original protector nature still endured and remained in the form of her serving as the enforcer of a divine treaty whereby all of the gods of every pantheon are to keep their influence to the old world, not the new, essentially. Like basically, Farn has, similar to Earth, an old world and a new world, and the new world is not entirely free of pantheons, but is mostly free of heavy divine influence from the pantheons. And that's 8 of the abundant Argon so far. The next 7 can all directly or indirectly trace their origins to the same place. And yes, this is something that no matter how indirectly, is Ludin's fault. So all 7 of these can, in part, be traced back to Ludin. And only 3 of the remaining 10 formed without any direct tie to falling, although one of them is questionable, so it could technically be considered 8 that are tied, or it could be, but it's explicitly 7 definitively. But this will require a lot of lore to understand the background of, so let's start with this. Cydonia, the Farn equivalent to Atlantis, was a continent midway between the New World and the Old World. Topola, the main city on that continent, was the capital of the Toplan Empire. The Toplans, read Atlanteans, had magical advancements loosely equal to or slightly superior to modern-day Farn. And because modern-day Farn is loosely equal to Earth, in Earth terms, they had technology rivaling 2025 levels of technology, potentially slightly better than what we have now. The Toplan Empire spanned both the New World and the Old World over 70,000 years ago. In their minds, they brought enlightenment to the primitive cultures around the world. They colonized, they settled, they established trade outposts, and they saw themselves as enriching the entire planet. Those who they were colonizing, on the other hand, and those that they were conquering, had a different opinion of their actions. And I do want to make a series about what happened, but to give a short summary, eventually zealotry, arrogance, corruption, and apathy led to the circumstances where Dabadon, the commander, would undergo his demonic ascension around 70,000 years before the modern day. And Dabadon is the demon godlord of the sin slothfulness. He is the 4th of the apocalyptic abundant Argon. So with Sanatos, Bemohet, Athaneva, and Dabadon, if they are present, it's going to have apocalyptic events unfold, because they all together were responsible for sinking the entire continent of Cydonia with all 1 billion inhabitants still on it. So 1 billion people gone overnight. An entire continent sunk to the bottom of the ocean because of these four. And the consequences of an entire continent sinking to the bottom of the ocean also sent gigantic civilization ending tidal waves across the world, wiping out nearly every coastal city overnight. Right. And it didn't stop there because this catastrophe left what would be deemed the Toplin legacy, a mythical claim to being true heirs of greatness, which was the Toplin Empire. And that might sound familiar to people familiar with the Roman Empire. Yes, it's the same idea. Essentially, it's like if people claimed that the Romans had Atlantean ancestry and that they were Atlantean / Roman greatness, that kind of thing that exists on Earth. This is the Farn equivalent of it, and it's very predominant, and because it's the backing behind every colonial and every imperial mindset to follow, all of them aiming to reclaim the lost glory of Cydonia, all of them claiming to be the successors of the Toplans, all of them essentially saying they have a divine holy right to do what they are doing because they are the chosen people of greatness, essentially. And that legacy starts with Toran. Toran was the easternmost outpost of the Toplin Empire, a trade colony established to easily connect with the Farn equivalent to Asia, essentially. Toran can be thought of as the Farn equivalent to Troy. And eventually you'll catch on what if you remember early 2000s or even late 1990s games, you might actually figure out where I get this influence from. But moving on. Toran was, by some method, displaced in time by approximately 60,000 years. Potentially 66,666 if we want to be extra dramatic. I haven't canonized the method of the time displacement. Like, it would probably either be like a magical glacier of sort, locking them in place a la Dylan Hunt Andromeda style, or it would be them literally being flung forward in time where they were 1 minute an outpost of Topla, and then next find out Topla has been gone for over 60,000 years. Like, the method, regardless of the method of displacement, them being displaced by about 60,000 years or so, is canonical. Like, I haven't canonized the method, but that it happened is canon. And Toran would go on to form the Toran Empire, spanning the Farn equivalent of the Mediterranean Sea, essentially, forming their own outposts. They would expand into areas even the Toplin Empire had in, both going further east and south, colonizing effectively the Farn equivalents to Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, spanning all the way to like the Farn equivalent to India, essentially. Their adventuring culture was structured largely like Danganronpa, with adventurers highly specialized to ultimate extremes, hyper competent to godlike ascents in their chosen fields, and using those fields to accomplish great feats. This is like basically an era of heroes, like heroes of like Greek lore, like Hercules, Jason, Odysseus, is like where they have something that is really, really impressive about them, and they would use that to go on and do their heroics. The cousin people to the Taurans, the Tinians, are on that note, the Farn equivalent to at least one iteration of Greece. Tinia was another Toplan outpost originally, but unlike Torin, Tinia had to take the slow path forward, and that led to degradation and divergence and basically barely holding on and spreading out on their own. But they were ethnically and culturally identical to identical during the time of the Toplands to Torin. So, well, at the time of the sinking of Cydonia, they knew what they had been, and stories of that Toplan heritage and the displacement of Torin survived the 60,000 year gap. Largely through oral history and, not perfectly, but surprisingly competently preserved history by word of mouth, essentially. And when Torin did finally reappear, the two cousin people were happy to see each other and establish good relationships with each other. Torin freely shared their Toplan technology, culture, and history with their cousins, who were open to it and gladly took it and actually were willing to accept the Toplan way as their own because they knew that it had once been theirs and that they had a lot they could gain from adapting these things. But it didn't last because ultimately the Tinians felt eventually betrayed by the Taurans. Tauran had an easy path to expand their empire, essentially going always except north, to match and in many ways exceed the territory of the Toplan Empire. They went everywhere and were expanding deep into areas that Topla never touched because during the time of Topla, there was geographical barriers that were since removed that the Taurans could take advantage of. Tinia, in contrast, could only expand into the bitter, harsh northern regions, which were inhabited by people who were adept at pushing the Tinians back. And the inability to freely expand to make an empire of the size of Tauran, and because as the Norcan regions left the Tinians basically trapped, left the Tinians feeling like the Taurans were deliberately stifling their growth. The Taurans, in contrast with their Toplan arrogancy, felt it was best to let their cousins strike out on their own. After all, they did make progress in colonizing parts of the Norcan region, which is very important, by the way, because Norcan descendants will cling to that loose thread. Norcans are loosely the Farn equivalent of ancient Germanic, Celtic, and Norse people if they were all rolled into one. And Norcan raiders would later, through their descendants, form one of the modern superpowers of Farn. But that's a lore for a different day. The important thing is the Tinians were struggling to really have the same kind of success on their own merits. They could succeed by having a pseudo-subservient relationship, but they felt like they were not being treated as true equals, despite the Tinians believing that despite the Taurans believing that the Tinians were being treated like true equals. And that led to the Tinians having their idea of striking out on their own as declaring war on the Taurans. But in that resulting war, the two were evenly matched in a long stalemate. Yes, this is essentially the Trojan War. Eventually, there was a call for a truce to be signed within the impenetrable walls of Tauran, Like, no amount of sieging could get the Tenians to break through the Topolan era the fortress of Torin, because Topola had a vastly superior force field technology, essentially. The Tinians, with their plan, which is basically a Trojan horse, expected the Taurans to be so arrogant they wouldn't expect it was a trap, with them planning to effectively red wedding the Taurans within their own walls. They expected that once they got the in of being able to be inside the walls on false pretenses of a truce, that they could massacre all of Tauren and essentially take over. The Taurens, however, weren't that stupid. They actually suspected shenanigans and thought they had sufficiently prepared. So both were half right. The Taurens were arrogant because they did not prepare enough, but they were not so arrogant as to be caught completely off guard. And that led to both being surprised by the other, and instead of a desired decisive blow, it was a bloodbath that was closer to a mutual kill. Technically, it was a Tinian Pyrrhic victory because they actually achieved their goal and had offshore survivors who would retreat from the scene of the disaster. And all of this is because of the birth of a new member of the abundant Argon, Dumos the Deceiver. As an adventurer, he was considered the ultimate analyst, and yes, those who know their Danganronpa lore can guess that means he became the demon godlord of the sin, despair. He predicted everything about what the Tinians would do and was ignored. And the Taurens lost the battle because as their impenetrable walls were their main advantage, and lacking it, the Tinians had a slight advantage. Like without Dumos, it was like 75% in the favor of the, well, it's more like 60-40. Like, it was that close where like 10% of the Tinian force would have survived if not for Dumos. But because Dumos was the last survivor, he went on to massacre the Tinians, the 10% who survived the bloody battle, to leave there to be no survivors. So Tinia lost all of its military, the majority of its leadership, and most of its navy overnight in what was basically the death of both empires. So it was left vulnerable to invasion on all sides. The Tauran colonies of Ranmoa and Thurga briefly united in vengeance to strike out against Tinia from the south and the west. Meanwhile, the Norcans were reclaiming their territory from the north, and completing the pressure on Tinia was raiders from the east, led by Belchevor, the Consumer. Like, literally, Tinia was attacked on all sides and could defend none of them. And since this is one of the two Dark Ages in Farn history, loosely akin in time to the effect of the Bronze Age collapse, like, it's in that time period, basically. So if you know about the Bronze Age collapse and how we went from having a lot to having a little, to having civilizations to having small tribes, that's what happens here. And that's why not much is known about Belchevor, other than he was likely an insectoid race of some kind whose conquests led to his demonic ascension. And he became the demon god lord of the sin, gluttony. But because of the Tauran colonies, civilization was still around, just not in that portion of the world. So after Tinia inevitably collapsed, the the unifying force between Ranmoa and Thurga collapsed, and the two both laid claim to the title of the Topolan Legacy, which led into the Legacy Wars. If you couldn't guess, Thurga is the Farn equivalent to Carthage, and Ranmoa is the Farn equivalent to Rome, with this Legacy Wars being the Farn equivalent to the Punic Wars. And, like on Earth, Ranmoa would ultimately win, establishing the Romulan Empire, which spanned the geography you would expect a Roman Empire to. The downfall of the Romulan Empire was the same factors of most of these empires: greed, corruption, and apathy. They wanted to continue expanding, but lacked the resources to do so. They were already arguably overextending, and with greed, corruption, apathy setting in, there was less of a desire for people to keep going, but at the same time they wanted the benefits from expanding their lands and conquering. So they forcefully drafted a peaceful scholar named Mastimo and enlisted his help forcefully. And they perverted his knowledge into weapons of war. Mastimo was not amused. He was truly, at the time, a pacifist who just wanted to search for knowledge, and particularly about demons. He literally wrote a book on demonkind because he was an expert demon summoner. And you might remember that I mentioned Mastimo, the Forsaken Scholar, who was a member of the Abundant Argon. Sure enough, this is him. And guess what? He destroyed the Romulan Empire and demonically ascended to become the demon godlord of the sin Knowledge. The fall of the Romulan Empire left numerous splinters because, Mastimo didn't, track down all of these cities and destroy them. He just kind of cut off their communication with each other by virtue of what he ended up doing. And these splinters were united by someone who is either called King Arnos or King Arneros, depending on the source, who is basically a combination of King Arthur, Jason of the Argonauts, and King Charlemagne the Great. He was a nautical adventurer turned great king who united these fractured people to form the Federation of Ranmoan Children. Loosely, you can think of this as essentially the first iteration of the Holy Roman Empire, led by one king as the head of it. But tragically, his early death led to the Federation of Ranmoan Children having a conflict which led to private businesses effectively seizing control of the Thracian Empire, as it was now called. Basically, instead of this being a time of increased church power, where churches would become essentially a theocracy, this is a time where private businesses stepped in to essentially take control of everything. And there is a ocracy term for that, but I'm blanking on it, but you know what I mean. These private corporations effectively ran everything, including adventuring. As a for-profit venture, you had to pay to live, you had to pay to exist, essentially, breaking thousands of years of tradition regarding adventurers largely being closer to socialism and or communism in structure, where adventurers, for good reason, receive a lot of services for free in exchange for what those adventurers offer largely for free. Suffice to say, this late-stage capitalistic hellscape did not end well for the Thracian Empire. Eventually, Zeboel, the Striker, the next member of the Abundant Argon, would destroy the Thracian Empire in a rebellion which led to to their demonic ascension. Zeboel, by the way, is the only explicitly Enby member of the Abundant Argon with they-them pronouns. They became the demon god lord of the sin, Endy. And I have actually recorded one of Zeboel's songs because I want to make a musical about this period. But the result of this was the Farn equivalent to the Dark Ages, because it was basically the final collapse of civilization as it was known. Like, while the Farachian Empire had a valid claim to the Topolan Empire legacy because of being immediately after the fall of the Ramoan Empire, its collapse left only the distant memory of greatness, with fractured nations forming in its wake. And this, over time, led to the landscape you would expect for the Middle Ages through the Renaissance era in Icacia, which is the Farn equivalent to Western Europe. Nations eventually began to form, mostly finalized borders, had stronger independent cultures, warred with each other, had kings and nobles, and the whole works of feudalism, essentially, of those monarchies, and the stuff you would expect. Eventually, though, this would lead to two more of the Abundant Argon manifesting as a consequence of this landscape in different parts of the world. Bathai, the false chosen, was a prodigy adventurer and great leader who represented a threat to the elites of his society. One of these elites, who was actually someone that Bathai thought was an ally, sent Lilith to assassinate him. And much to her chagrin, because Lilith is a contract killer, and by contract killer I mean kills people who contract her, she did not want to go through with it, but she was forced to execute this order and impaled Bathai through the chest from behind. But his dying corpse from a high building plummeted and landed in the ruins of a temple to Dumos. Dumos at this time basically did not exist on Farn. Like, between him having ascending to demon godlordhood when he was the last survivor of the Taurans to now, he ran afoul of Milady being the enforcer of the treaty because he violated that treaty, and as a consequence had effectively been banished from Farn. Like, he tried to claim legitimacy that because he was a descendant of the Toplands and there were descendants of Toplands in the New World, he could have a legitimate claim to it that he could lay. But his loophole was considered insufficient and he got wrecked. And part of the price of having violated that was his entire following, history, and very existence was erased. Like, he was entirely unpersoned, and effectively Farn would have no idea he ever was around. But Bathai, dying and bleeding out in his temple, allowed Dumos to connect with Bathai and make a deal with the demon. Dumos would save Bathai's life in exchange for possessing Bathai, because demons can possess people. Again, not something I want to talk about the mechanics of, but you just need to know that demons can possess people, and Dumos possessed Bathai, right, and enlisted Bathai in becoming an agent of restoring Dumos' presence on Farn. Like, possession does not actually give any level of control. It's more like a voice in the back of the head, essentially. basically, yeah, Dumos was there, but it was still Bathai doing everything. And Bathai, already in the mindset of seeking vengeance against those conspirators who killed him, agreed to this because he got impaled, and it was by an assassin in the form of Lilith who basically told him as much as she could because she was angry that she had to actually go through with it. And I want to turn this story into a webcomic, so I'm not going to say much about it, except that the end result of this all was Bathai becoming Dumos's equal, becoming the demon god lord of the sin Ambition. In a different corner of the world in a similar time frame, the various nations of Icasia were colonizing the continent of Angea, displacing the locals, enslaving them, etc. Again, colonization with all the consequences of it. I'm not going to go into details of it. If you know your history, you know what that kind of thing would entail. All of that. Rarma, the ensnarer, was a child of a white father and a black mother on Angea, and she could pass as a relatively tan white person, but she was still very much a child of both those worlds, with all the trauma that entailed. And I'm also planning to tell her story, but the short form of it is she met a guy who became her one true love. They became warlords together and effectively declared war against all the other warlords and every nation colonizing Angea, because those are two different groups. Loosely, the warlords sometimes worked with colonizers and sometimes were against colonizers. Warlords fought other warlords. Sometimes warlords would band together. It's basically all the sides were against all sides. But sometimes they would band together to fight against a common enemy, and Rarma and her husband made themselves that common enemy. And eventually, from this declaration of war against all the inhabitants of the continent, essentially, Rarma ended up mortally wounded. Her husband kept her in stasis and managed to fight off all of her enemies while healing her, enough to eventually revive her from that mortally wounded state to have a chance to survive. But in the process, he himself got mortally wounded. And while a recovered Rarma could do the same for him that he did for her, a just revived Rarma was too weak to reciprocate the stasis. And the two had saved each other countless times by this point, but she wasn't able to save him this time so immediately after he had saved her. And when she lost him, she took this quite poorly. She embraced the worst traits of both herself and her husband and them together, and essentially expanded their plans, following through with those plans, and didn't just fend off the opposition. She brutally crushed them and conquered the entire continent. And obviously, something of that scope, she was driven to the demonic ascension by the maddening irony of how she could have everything she could ever ask for. Anything she could ever want, and she could get as a demon god lord ruling a continent, except for the one and only thing she truly wanted. Because not even an abundant Argon can revive the truly dead, and her lover was truly dead, so was gone for good. And that caused her to become the demon god lord of the sin, greed. And all 7 of those trace back indirectly to Ludin, because Ludin's actions drove the actions which created the Toppling Empire, and through the sinking of Sidonia, the resulting chain of events. And like the only other member of the Abundant Argon who has claimed to having influenced that many members of the Abundant Argon is Lilith. And like this is something that will kind of get told during records, but Lilith was there for basically half of them in some way, shape, or form. Like, Lilith was a small part in Dabadon. Lilith, uh, Lilith was, uh, Lilith was who Mastamos summoned to help him be a scholar of demons. And then Lilith was the assassin of Bathai, and once she was actually able to kill, her summoner was actually killed by Bathai, she joined Bathai as an ally. Then Rarmar's husband actually summoned Lilith because Lilith was the actual person to put Rarma in the stasis while she was mortally wounded. And that's 4 so far that Lilith has. And like Lilith has basically influenced half of the Abundant Argon to become members of the Abundant Argon. And you'll see that a little bit more. But to backtrack a bit chronologically, Faymustizel. Actually, I should. 1 second. I need to actually. I do have his name's official pronunciation written down. 1 second while I find it, because even I struggle with his name, and I'm about to explain why he has that convoluted name. Here we go. Yeah, it's Faymustazel. Yeah. Okay, so Faymustazel. Okay, so Faymustazel. I'm going with that. I'm saying it again and again. Faymustazel became the demon god lord of the sin Fear, with the side of the seed, a few 100,000 years before modern times. So like less than 6,000 years ago, but more than 2,000 years ago. And you might wonder why Faymustazel's name is that convoluted, and it's by his design. He is the demon god lord of contracts. And when you think, deal with the devil, he is that devil. He is the devil you deal with for contracts. It'd be him you're making a deal with. And as the demon of contracts, he's an expert at making people who arrogantly think they have bested him painfully realize they have been tricked by Faymustazel, the trickster. To understand why, you have to know how demon true names work. The true names of demons are well known. Everyone knows Lilith is Lilith. Everyone knows Ludin is Ludin. Everyone knows all of the Abundant Argon's true names because they're that important. It's basically impossible to not know their true names and what they look like. Right? So, like, the true identities of demons are well known. So a contractor or summoner, knowing a demon's true name, offers them no power over that demon. Like, it means nothing to know that Lilith is Lilith. It means nothing to know Ludin is Ludin. It means nothing to know Faymustazel is Faymustazel. Unless the demon acknowledges their true name in the presence of their summoner or contractor. If they explicitly say, yes, this is me, then they are bound to the one who brought them to Farn. So like, if Faymustazel were to say, yes, I am Faymustazel, that would give his contractor power over him. And this is the reason why demons have hundreds of aliases and titles. Like, I haven't thought of all of the hundreds for all 18 of them, but you should see my list of names Lilith uses as aliases. It's a long, long list because, like, throughout all of history, they have been known by countless names that they have used to avoid acknowledging their true name. And they use those aliases and titles to avoid being recognized as having acknowledged who they are to their summoner. And Faye Mustazel, by virtue of his name and the spelling thereof being ridiculously hard to get right, weaponizes this. His name is deliberately hard to get right because he wants people to mess it up. He will acknowledge misspoken versions of his name and typos thereof to let contractors think they have been given full control. Like if I said, what was it? If I said Faye Mustazel instead of Phi Mustazel, well, if I said Faye Mustazel, or Phi Muse, like basically you have to get it perfect for his name in order to actually risk him having it be acknowledged. Like any mistake, no matter how small, will invalidate it being something where he gives them full control. And because of that, because people almost never perfectly pronounce his true name, it doesn't count as being his true name, meaning they actually hold no power over him, and they find this out the hard way. And then another one who is also independent is the youngest of the current abundant Argon in manifesting, even though she's been around for an eternity. Again, all of them have been around the entire time. Rothosta has been contracted and appeared as a contracted demon throughout all of history, even though Rothosta is the youngest who has only been around for 100 years. Like, I originally had her title up until today as the First Inquisitor, but when I was preparing this video, I realized that all 5 of the primordial demon godlords have first in their primary titles, and none of the other 15 do, except for Rothosta having had First Inquisitor. So I'm looking for a new, is it an adverb? Between the and Inquisitor. Currently, I'm using a placeholder of Sullen, but that might change later if I think of a better replacement for first. But for now, we're calling her Rothosta, the Sullen Inquisitor. It will probably change to something else later, but you get the idea. And Rothosta is the demon godlord of the sin sacrifice. She was sent by a now long-gone nation to prevent demons from crossing through a portal connecting the demon realm with Farn, and she would fight them on the demon realm side of that portal. And while guarding that portal on the demon realm side, she would never age, and so she was an eternal guardian of preventing mass demonic incursion onto Farn. And again, this is normal demons, because normal demons have a wide variety to them. I would have to talk about demons in order to explain that more, but I don't feel like doing that. She did this as a mortal for at least 1,000 years. Like, she was just a human. She was just a normal human. And in that time, she was informed by the abundant Argon, who some of them regularly visited her. Lilith did, and that's why Lilith also that's why Rothosta is among the ones that Lilith has made. Mastamo did, And like in those visits, she was informed nothing remained of her nation. Everyone she knew had had their lineage died out with no living descendants. All records of her kingdom were lost, erased, etc. In short, nothing of her mortal life remained, and she had no reason to keep fighting. Like she could quit at any time because there was nothing left for her to be defending. Like she was just keeping demons out, but she didn't need to. Like if she stopped, someone else from the then modern day would inevitably have to replace her. So she could stop at any time, but she didn't. She she just kept on fighting and fighting and fighting until about 100 years ago when she just snapped. She had known she had consumed the essence of enough demons where she could become a demon god for over 1,000 years. She just chose not to. She chose to remain mortal until one day she just didn't. She just succumbed and became the 17th of the abundant Argon. This will be explained in records, by the way, so I don't feel the need to explain it in detail, but basically it's the one bad day kind of concept, where no amount of strength can overcome one bad day, essentially. As for the 18th abundant Argon, they have yet to manifest on Farn. Their effects on the world have already been felt, with them being a member of every demon conference, but they haven't actually manifested on Farn yet, so their identity is unknown because the events leading to their birth as a demon godlord haven't yet transpired. Because of this, the 18th demon godlord could be anyone, and the demon godlord could thus be any sin. Like anything that could feasibly be a sin, the demon godlord could be the sin of, and anyone could potentially be that demon godlord. Of course, I know who the 5 possible 18th members of the abundant Argon would be, each representing a different possible 18th sin. While anyone could be the 18th, only 5 people have the circumstances where they might become the 18th. And this is very, very, very spoiler-ishy territory, because, like, obviously, I know who the 18th abundant Argon could be, and I don't want to give you any hints or any, signs. So, I will share this much. The 18th demon godlord could be the sin of insanity, clarity, regret, conflict, or pacifism. Who the final 18th demon godlord is, depending on which of the people it would be one of those as what they are the sin of, the demon godlord of sin, basically. And you might wonder, if there's 5 candidates for being a demon godlord, why are there only 18 slots? Why are there only 18 possible demon godlords and not 24? And that's because the circumstances surrounding these people mean that any one of them becoming a demon godlord would automatically lock the others out. It would change the landscape of Farn in a way that would prevent the circumstances for the other 4 to become a demon godlord. In short, it's not that there must be 18 demon godlords, never more, never less. It's that it's only possible for 18 individuals to become demon godlords because of the circumstances surrounding the birth of the demon godlords. 17 already have had those circumstances happen, and 5 people could be the 18th, but any one of those 5 becoming the 18th changes the other 4 in ways making it impossible for them to become a demon godlord anymore. And the best way I can think of to explain this spoiler-free is to ask you to imagine a hypothetical. Hypothetically, say all 5 candidates for the 18 were close friends, and the only trigger condition for becoming the 18th Demon God Lord was a tragedy where the other 4 died. Sure, if there were multiple trigger conditions, then it would be possible to have 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, up to 24 Demon God Lords. But lacking that, because there is only one and only one trigger condition, in this case being the hypothetical of the other 4 people possible being killed, there can always only be one final demonic ascension to become a demon god lord. Right? So basically, while any of those 5 could be the final abundant Argon, only one trigger condition can ever trigger. One condition triggering is mutually exclusive with all of the others triggering because that trigger condition prevents the other 4 triggers from ever being possible. The paths are too far diverged. Like, there's no way to have both paths trigger, only one is possible. And since all 18 of the Abundant Argon have been at every major demon conference, starting with the first, they have always known they would have 18 in total. That's why Massimo proposed calling the demon god lords the Abundant Argon. And that name does have multiple layers. It's pretty obvious, I think, but also I don't feel like spelling it out why Abundant Argon is the name for 18 demon god lords today. Maybe I'll do that another time. They knew no matter what, circumstances would play out to have that number eventually. Not because it was set to be 18, not because it was written into the universe to be 18, but rather because it just so happened that circumstances behind the formation of the 18th would prevent any future possibility of more demon god lords. Basically, the 18th demon god lord, who has not yet appeared on Farn, what they do when they do appear on Farn changes Farn in a way that prevents the ability for anyone else to ever need to become a demon god lord, essentially. And I hope that clarifier helps explain the concept where it's not a rule of there must be 18 exactly, and it's instead just, well, 18 of us form at some point. The only thing I want to clarify is at this point is that about half of the Abundant Argon have kingdoms on Farn and permanently reside there, and the other half only dwell on Farn when summoned. The 5 primordials, which again is Belreach, Ataneva, Damohet, Thludin, Lilith, plus Sanatos, Dabadon, Zeboel, Famustazel, and Mathasta, all of them have no kingdoms on Farn, and thus they exist on Farn exclusively through summons and contracts should they choose to actually be on Farn. They mainly dwell primarily within the demon realm. Whereas Milady, Tricero, Dumos, Belchivor, Mastimo, Bathai, Rarma, and the 18th Abundant Argon all possess kingdoms on Farn, or, well, in the case of the 18th, will possess a kingdom on Farn. And that's part of the reason why there can't be Abundant Argon past the 18th is because the 18th Abundant Argon's kingdom will essentially change Farn in a way that prevents the circumstances for future Abundant Argon being possible. And, like, effectively the subjects of those Abundant Argon are kind of sort of a form of permanent summoning and contracting of their leaders. And there's a lot more to demons, demon lords, demon gods, and demon god lords, which are all 4 separate things, and how each of those 4 is different from each other, and how demons in general work, like the rules of contracts and summons and such. much because I'm only touching on the bare minimum of the mechanics involved. And most of the abundant Argon have a lot more to their stories and their characters and what they cover. In all of this time, I didn't cover any of their secondary domains, which are actually one of the biggest parts of who they are, because that's actually what they're usually worshipped for. Like, people pray to the demon god lords to provide them something. And while it can be their primary domain, the domain of their sin, it's usually actually their secondary traits they are getting worshipped for. For instance, Lilith's primary worshippers are slaves praying for freedom, as Lilith's secondary domain is freedom from slavery, loosely speaking. It's actually just that she's anti-slavery, but same idea essentially. Each of the abundant Argon, including the 18th, have secondary aspects to them, and at least one pro something and a correlating anti something are those secondary aspects. And those secondary aspects are why the demon god lords receive worship in the first place, by and large. And that's one of the main reasons that they are one of the predominant pantheons on Farn, is because of their effects on Farn and because of the worship they receive for their secondary traits. But I think describing all of these secondary traits is best saved for a different ramble. I hope you enjoyed this one.